development are well documented. We know that poverty decreases children's life chances. Today I want to focus on another harmful aspect of poverty that often gets overlooked: class-based stereotypes and stigma. In 1972, Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobbs published a groundbreaking book titled The Hidden Injuries of Class that drew attention to this issue. In interviews with working-class women and men in Boston, they found that respondents expressed a variety of feelings about their class status. It ranged from anger, pain, humiliation, and at times even self-blame. Despite recognizing structural barriers to upward mobility, there was also a sense of failure for having, quote, not made it. This isn't surprising. In the United States, it's widely believed that anyone can succeed if they work hard and persevere. And when viewed from this lens, poverty could be perceived as a personal failure. This stigmatization is one of the hidden injuries of class. Although children are not typically held responsible for their socioeconomic position, they are exposed to and are aware of dominant messages that place responsibility for poverty on low-income families themselves. These beliefs can seep into how children understand and think about their own position. They can also influence how low-income children are treated by peers and adults, and they can influence support for and design of safety net programs. And that's really what I want to talk about today. This afternoon, I'd like to very quickly give you an overview of two issues. I want to focus on the impact of beliefs and stereotypes on children's well-being, and also on support for safety net programs. As you know, across the United States and in our own state, California, it can be difficult to gain traction on strong poverty alleviation policies. And I really believe that part of the problem lies in the ways that we think about or understand poverty. Throughout this work, I'll draw on research findings from public opinion polls, from the social sciences, and also from some of my own scholarship. Two beliefs are central to how we view social class and poverty in the United States, and those are really individualism and meritocracy. There's a strong belief in the United States that we're sort of the masters of our own destiny, that we can pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. And as a result, we also tend to see social class as an achieved or an earned status, a reflection of merit, rather than an ascribed status. And you can see here some findings from a Pew Research Center poll that really highlights how Americans stand out in terms of individualism. This is looking across countries. The percent who disagree that success in life is pretty much determined by forces outside our control. And you can see the United States at 57% in the lead with that belief. The bottom part of the chart, the percent who say it's very important, this is on a 10-point scale, to work hard to get ahead in life. And again, you see the United States pulling out with these very strong individualistic beliefs. They're woven into the very fabric of our society. And just a second chart, again, from the Pew Research Center, that I think really illustrates meritocracy. And meritocracy is really the belief that individuals get ahead and earn rewards in direct proportion to their efforts and abilities. And here you see this strong belief that hard work will pay off. The United States is up at the top. The yellow bar, most succeed if work hard. 77% of respondents endorsing that belief. So the United States is very individualistic society, and that really fuels how we think about poverty and social class. In particular, these beliefs influence why we think some people are rich and others are poor. So that really fundamental question, why are some people rich? Why are some people poor? Social scientists study those questions in terms of the types of attributions that people make, how we answer those questions. And all of us engage in attributions about ourselves and others on a daily basis. Probably 100 times a day, you ask yourself why X. It may not be about poverty or wealth, could be about something else. There are three primary causal explanations that people in the United States tend to give for poverty. The first, individualistic causes, tends to focus on the role of the individual, her or himself, in terms of causing or creating economic hardship. Common individualistic explanations that people give are things like laziness, lack of motivation, disinterest in education, inability to save and spend money wisely. And you can see here, these are very negative interpretations that really situate responsibility for poverty on the individual, her or himself. And also embedded in these attributions are stereotypes about low-income people. A second type of attribution is structural attributions. And structural attributions really focus on societal factors, institutions, things like underfunded schools, low-paying jobs, or discrimination. A third type of explanation are those that are fatalistic, that focus on factors beyond the individual's control. And those might include things like bad luck or illness or disability. Now, as you might guess, in the United States, there is a tendency to make individualistic attributions. And in fact, individualistic attributions overall tend to be supported more strongly in the United States than structural attributions. There are, however, many group differences as well. Individualistic attributions for poverty tend to be favored over structural explanations among higher status groups, including men, European Americans, and higher income groups, whereas structural attributions tend to be preferred over individualistic causes among women, African Americans, and low-income groups. And in a number of studies over the years, I've looked at these beliefs among diverse groups. For example, looking at attributions for poverty among social workers and women receiving public assistance, low-income and middle-income women and men, Mexican-American farm workers, and consistently, I tend to find greater support for structural causes among low-income groups. And it seems that these structural sources of inequality may be harder for more privileged groups to see. And in part, that's probably because of this deeply embedded individualism and meritocracy that is part of our society. And of course, these beliefs are very complex. Most of us at the individual level probably endorse some complicated combination of the two. We might make different attributions depending on who the target person is that we're making that judgment about. But suffice it to say, there tends to be this overall preference for individualistic explanations in the United States. And one of the reasons that individualistic explanations are so powerful or important is because of the kinds of consequences they can have. They can influence the types of policies that we support. They can influence how we think about ourselves and also how we think about others, and particularly how we think about economic inequality. And you'll note, and I mentioned this, but I'll just say it one more time, keep in mind that embedded in these individualistic attributions are common stereotypes, common classist stereotypes. There are numerous studies that look at the prevalence of classist stereotypes, things like that low-income groups devalue education or are lazy or unmotivated. It is also the case that stereotypes about social class and poverty and attributions intersect with other group memberships as well, particularly race and gender. So racism and sexism and classism can really collide and intersect in the lives of low-income youth. Not surprisingly, individualistic attributions tend to be associated with lack of support for progressive or strong safety net policies. Structural attributions tend to predict support for more progressive policies. And this makes sense. If we think people are to blame for their economic situation, we're going to be less likely to want to support or invest in those programs. And not surprisingly, beliefs about poverty tend to be highly partisan. This chart from the Pew Research Center shows the widening gap between Republicans and Democrats on why people are rich and poor. And you can see these red and blue lines really pulling apart from each other. In the first column, the percent who say a person is rich generally because they worked harder than most other people. 66% of Republican and Republican-leaning respondents endorsing that belief, compared to just 29% of Democrats or Democratic-leaning respondents. Next, the percent who say a person is poor generally because of lack of effort on their part. 56% endorsement by Republicans or leaning Republican, compared to 19% of those leaning Democrat. And while there has been some shift in overall attitudes in response to the economic recession and some of the kind of major overhauls we've seen in recent years, it remains the case that individualistic attributions remain strong. You know, most research that looks at beliefs about poverty, attributions, stereotyping, has really tended to focus on adult beliefs and attitudes. And you see that in the public opinion polls that I just showed you. But increasingly, researchers are focusing on children and children's beliefs. And this is a very important and needed development. This is a proposed model from Heberle and Carter from 2015. And they're speculating about how beliefs about poverty and stereotypes can influence children's cognitive processes. Over on this side of the chart, I know it may be hard to see for some of you, are some of the traditional markers we think of: economic disadvantage, material hardship, contextual stressors. We might put beliefs and attributions in the middle of our model, with our outcomes being child emotional functioning and also academic performance, among others. Not surprisingly, we are learning that children are aware of social class and class-based stereotypes at a young age. Beliefs are learned through the media, through parents, through peers, and sometimes even policymakers. For example, HUD Secretary Ben Carson recently questioned whether public housing might be too comfortable. Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, several years ago, raised concerns about the safety net, quote, turning into a hammock that lulls able-bodied people to lives of dependency and complacency. So you hear those kind of stereotypes put front forward in those types of remarks. So what do we know about kids in a nutshell? As early as preschool, children can identify the rich and poor as different groups. Children's beliefs about poverty and economic inequality become more complex with age, shifting from surface characteristics or superficial characteristics to beliefs that align more closely with adults. In a seminal study by Leahy of children ages 6 to 17, he found that 6-year-olds emphasized possessions or other observable characteristics in differentiating between rich and poor people. Definitional explanations of wealth and poverty, things like the rich are rich because they have money, were also common among this age group. Well, you gotta say it. By 11, there was greater emphasis on psychological traits or characteristics, and also equity considerations, with children explaining wealth and poverty on the basis of job status, intelligence, education, and effort. Among 14 and 17-year-olds, poverty tended to be attributed to lack of education and effort, and in seeing wealth as deserved. In other words, with age, children increasingly justified inequality. As with adults, there are class differences in how children describe poverty and people who are poor. Lower SES children have been found to focus more on the thoughts of poor kids, whereas more privileged children tend to emphasize these traits or characteristics, some of which can be stereotypical. Based on these findings, it appears that low-income children may have more empathy and also more complex views about poverty than middle-income children, and that's not surprising. I think a take-home message here is that low-income children are aware of negative beliefs about poverty and about their families potentially. In one study, low-income children expected poor households to be described as, quote, messy, dirty, stupid, as not good people, and as doing drugs or stealing. And although these children also described poor people in positive terms, this may not be enough to protect them from some of these larger damaging messages. Academic stereotypes about poor children's abilities are also common. In a study by Woods and her colleagues of African American and white 4th, 6th, and 8th graders, young people of both races believed that the rich were more competent in academics such as math, science, writing, and school grades than poor children. And these beliefs were especially pronounced among their African American respondents. And these beliefs can spill over into expectations about future career success. And I think collectively they really illustrate some of the reasons why we should be concerned with stereotypes and the stigmatization associated with poverty. There are many potential effects of these beliefs on low-income children's well-being, and that's what I want to turn more directly to now. And I'll also put in a plug to say this is really an area where we need a lot more research as well. But some of the potential effects. One, internalized classism, which internalized classism is really the endorsement of negative stereotypes about poverty and low-income people. And some potential consequences of this include lower self-esteem or sense of self-efficacy, depressive and anxiety or anxious symptoms, and distancing from others that are experiencing economic hardship. It's hard to feel close to a group which you know or see being derogated more broadly. Of course, these beliefs can also contribute to support for policies that further deepen the economic divide. And a recent study, it literally just came out by Erin Godfrey and her colleagues, I think really illustrates in a very powerful way some of this impact. They looked, basically they examined low-income youth and the negative consequences of believing in meritocracy, that belief that anyone can make it if they work hard. In 6th grade, believing the system to be fair, just, and meritocratic was associated with higher self-esteem, less deviant behavior, and better classroom regulation. Those are good things. However, over time, these same beliefs predicted worsening trajectories of outcomes. Endorsing these beliefs in 6th grade was associated with stronger declines in self-esteem and classroom behavior, and a greater rise in deviant behavior across 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. What do they make of this? What's their conclusion? They conclude that early beliefs about the fairness of the system might become a liability over time, as young people become increasingly aware of how the larger socioeconomic system puts them and their group at a disadvantage, and as their identity as a marginalized group member becomes more salient. A second potential consequence is around stereotype threat. And some of you, how many people have heard of stereotype threat? Pretty good number, but I'll say more. Stereotype threat occurs when negative stereotypes about a stigmatized group, could be race, class, gender, when those stereotypes become activated, when you're in a setting in which those stereotypes about a group to which you belong become activated. These activated stereotypes can cause anxiety for an individual. Think about it. You're in a situation that stereotypes become salient. You may become anxious. And stemming from that anxiety, your performance could be compromised. Much of the research on stereotype threat is in academic context. And what it tends to show is that in situations where the stereotype becomes heightened, for example, a test is described as diagnostic of your future or your academic performance, you're particularly likely to be affected by that stereotype. And the really important thing about stereotype threat is that you don't have to believe the stereotype yourself. So you don't have to believe that your group isn't good at math or whatever the context is. It's the fear of confirming that stereotype that compromises performance, undermines it. There's an enormous body of research looking at the impact of stereotype threat across race, gender, and social class. Very powerful literature. Last but certainly not least, the stigma associated with poverty can contribute to social exclusion and bias and discrimination. Low-income children are at risk of being excluded or discriminated against because of class status. Studies show that children, for example, at even a young age, associate greater wealth with greater competence and favor group members who are perceived as having more resources. And of course, we know that that carries over into adulthood because we're very much a society that values possessions and material goods. Importantly, though, this bias may not be conscious, and it may seep into how children are evaluated, particularly in educational contexts in which class is salient. In ambiguous situations, class may be used to make inferences about student performance, for example, and may give higher income students the benefit of the doubt. So in a situation that's unclear, you might be particularly likely to turn to stereotypes you might have about class, and that could influence the types of judgments that are made, for example, about a low-income student. In an ethnography by Stribe of a preschool classroom, teachers subtly, very subtly, contributed to the recreation of class privilege by engaging more fully with middle-class students and encouraging their linguistic development in ways that they just didn't do with lower-income kids. And it wasn't intentional, but it happened. So let me turn for the rest of the time that I have more directly to policy. I've already touched on this a little bit. Not surprising to you, the types of attributions that we make influences the degree to which we support different types of policies. And I've done a lot of work in this area that shows that individualistic attributions for poverty are correlated and at times can even predict support for restrictive welfare policies as well as restrictive housing policies. Support for structural attributions are associated with more progressive policies. So how might this play out in our more in our everyday lives? Some of you may recognize or remember this story. This is from, I believe it was 2013. And I think, my point here is that stereotypes can be used to generate support for or against specific policies. And negative stereotypes, particularly of people receiving public assistance, can be particularly harsh and common. This example is from a 2013 story that ran on Fox titled The Great Food Stamp Binge. And it featured the man pictured here. His name was Jason Greenslate. He is the alleged food stamp surfer who claimed to be using the program to buy lobster and sushi and avoid work. Now, this is not reality. And there were questions about the veracity of his claims, but just to get to the reality here, these types of stereotypes really do harm to the real recipients of the SNAP program, and those are primarily children, people who are elderly, and people with disabilities. The story, however, broke shortly before the U.S. House of Representatives voted to cut food stamps by 5% and drew attention away from the millions of people who rely on these programs. And after the vote, U.S. Representative Tim Husselkamp warned, "You can no longer sit on your couch or ride a surfboard like Jason in California and expect the federal taxpayer to feed you." But this is really not reality. Stereotypes also influence how safety net programs are perceived, with these programs themselves being seen as contributing to poverty. So here, more public opinion polls. Do you think that poor people who receive welfare benefits prefer to stay on welfare or would rather earn a living? And you can see, the breakdown here, rather earn a living, a distinction between those above and below poverty level, or prefer to stay on welfare. And although most respondents believe that people would rather earn their own living, there's still a pretty significant number, about a third, who believe that people prefer to stay on welfare. So let me forward to a contemporary issue. Clearly, stereotypes can inform both our support for policies. They can also support or influence policy design. And policies themselves can deepen the stigma that children feel. Lunch shaming refers to the humiliation experienced by children whose parents are late paying school lunch bills or don't have the resources to pay for them. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees the school lunch program, drew attention to this issue last year when it required school districts to establish a written policy for dealing with children who are unable to pay for school food. It encouraged districts to work out payment plans with families and to find ways to continue providing meals. But it did not explicitly bar them from humiliating children over the outstanding bills. Federal data shows that nearly half of school districts employ shaming policies. And these range from denying students food to substituting a cold sandwich in a brown bag instead of providing a hot meal. And of course, that brown bag is a marker, right, of difference or hardship. And in some cases, even worse techniques are used. And I know this is probably really hard to see on the slide. This is a student in Alabama who came home from school with the message, "I need lunch money," stamped on his arm. And I would argue that this is, obviously a very stigmatizing thing to do to any child. This is a chart from the USDA that basically summarizes the types of actions being taken at schools that are employing these policies. And you can see, most commonly the parents are being billed or providing students with an alternative meal until the debt is paid. That could take a lot of different forms. Administrative actions like withholding grades, trying to have a student retroactively approved for free meals, even using a debt collection agency. And of course, the bottom line is many of the families who are not paying these bills, it's simply because they can't. They don't have the resources to do so. It may also be the case that the stigma associated with some of these programs can make them difficult to apply for. But regardless, punishing the child is not a solution. It deepens hardship, and it doesn't get the bills paid either. Regardless of the approaches used, only 14% of SFAs recovered all of the revenues lost due to unpaid meals. At the other end of the spectrum, 51% of SFAs that had unpaid meals did not recover any of the lost revenue. There are, however, some promising actions that are being taken. At the federal level, the Anti-Lunch Shaming Act was introduced in both the House and the Senate with bipartisan support. And there are not very many things that have bipartisan support, but this is one that does. The bill bans schools from stigmatizing children whose parents cannot afford to pay for school lunches, and it requires schools to direct communication about unpaid bills to the parent, not the child. There's also action being taken at the state level. In April, New Mexico Governor Susana Martinez signed the Hunger-Free Student Bill of Rights, making New Mexico the first state to outlaw this so-called lunch shaming. Public schools there are required to serve the same hot lunches to all kids, regardless of how their parents are paying for it. And similar legislation has been drafted in Pennsylvania. And last, but certainly not least, right here in California, a bill has been introduced to address this issue, the Child Hunger Prevention and Fair Treatment Act of 2017. And it requires school districts to develop a plan to ensure that children are not shamed or treated differently if the student has unpaid school meal fees. provide an explanation of how staff will be trained, how parents and guardians will be assisted in applying for free and reduced price school meals. It prohibits the use of debt collectors and engages in some other important protective activities as well. This was introduced in February by Senator Hertzberg. And obviously this is very important. In California, 22.9% of families are food insecure. And we know that the meals provided at school fill a very important gap, and that child nutrition is directly related to school performance. However, these programs are under assault in the President's current budget proposal. So in closing, I hope I've illustrated at least some of the reasons why stereotypes and stigma are important for us to address and how they can amplify and deepen hardship for children. This is really an issue that we need to take seriously. We need to, have these types of biases and stigma not be hidden. Some suggestions or recommendations: it's really important that we develop comprehensive educational programs that teach children and adults about the structural causes of poverty. This is absolutely crucial, and there are promising findings from interventions with children and college students that you can really shift these kinds of negative attributions. Equally crucial is looking and analyzing covert and overt assumptions and how they can become embedded in policy design and implementation, even if not intended. So, with some of these practices that schools are engaging in, they may not be where they started, but they're where they're ending up, where a child is coming home from school with a stamp on his arm. Obviously, that's a very overt example. There are many more subtle examples. And finally, programs should be designed with the goal of minimizing stigma. Universal programs may be one way of doing that. I'll be interested to hear some of yours as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.